iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to this week's edition of the iHeartPodcast webinar speaker series. My name is Conal Byrne. I am the CEO of iHeart Digital. We've been doing this speaker series for the better part of 2 years now. We started it when we were moving into quarantine, and we wanted to keep talking amongst ourselves, but also with the public about this incredible medium that just kept growing called podcasting. And these have just, out of that, turned into a really, really cool series of conversations with creators we have that we're in business with, that we develop content with, and that we put out there in the world about where they come from, why they do what they do, why they've chosen podcasting as at least one of the mediums that they work in. And I really do cherish this half hour every week that I get to sit down and talk with some of those partners. This week is honestly a very special treat for me. I've been in podcasting going on 15 years, and there are a few sort of OG podcasters and podcasts that I have worked with almost for that entire time. Back in the Stuff Media days when we were a podcast network that was then subsequently acquired by iHeart and became essentially the iHeart Podcast Network. Two of those creators are Noel Brown and Ben Bolin. They've worked on podcasts since the medium was a thing almost. They've worked on multiple shows as hosts of shows, executive producers of shows. They drive millions and millions of podcast downloads a month. In terms of producers, but also voice talent hosts, they are two of the biggest folks in this medium, period, and have been for years. So first of all, Ben and Noel, as much as that intro probably still surprises you, thank you for joining me for the conversation. I do appreciate it.
Yeah, I compared it to like a frog boiling in water, where it's just like, if the temperature's low enough for a long enough time, you don't even realize that things have changed drastically. That's sort of like a negative example of what's happened to us over the years, but I always kind of have to look up and stock take where it's like, wow, we've been doing this for like 10 years. It's wild, and then come so far.
I would say honestly too, that to that point you made about our time in the medium together, I always have these weird moments where you and I are talking about something, and I remember that I started as an intern, and I would never have thought that we'd be here, but I think a lot of people would say the same. The growth has been pretty amazing.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think the images of an intern slowly boiling in a pot of water is something we'll spend the next...
We can all relate to that.
29 minutes trying to reverse that in all of our listeners' minds. You guys are going to make fun of me, but a lot of times on these conversations, I will talk about origin stories, and where they really do make fun of me for this. But I am fascinated with how people started. I think that at the end of the day, maybe very fundamentally, we're sort of communicators or storytellers. And there are people in the world who are really into that. And then there are others who don't really do that. You guys are clearly in that first bucket, but I've found that more often than not, something sparked that in your life. Some influence you had as a kid, or a friend, or a hero you looked up to. So Ben, starting with you, at what point in your life did you realize, oh, I'm a creator, a storyteller, I like to make content and talk about that content? Where did that come from?
Well, that came from, for me, that came from a lot. I was a voracious reader as a child. Noel and I are both only children. So I grew up in my own kind of imagined universe, and I was reading all the time, and I wanted to make the kind of stories that I wanted to see in the world. I adored Rod Serling as a child. I still do. And whenever I looked for every medium through which I could bring stories with people, often in a collaborative way. So I was a theater kid, of course. I was in writing programs, improv, did some film stuff, etc. And when podcasting first came out, and Conal, when you and I were working together in the early days, and we thought podcast is people talking about an article on the site for 5 minutes. You'll recall, and I know I always do this, but you'll recall that I was very much like, put me in the game, coach. any show. And my first crack at it was car stuff, and it was an amazing run, and I never looked back. And I love being able to explore these fascinating things. That's what we're doing. We're kind of making the shows we would want to listen to, which not everyone can say. I mean, what do you think, Noel? Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I come from a performing family. Both my parents were opera singers, so I grew up kind of as that was just a part of my life. It was just, I never questioned it, and I, grew up playing violin, and then decided to pivot more towards, wanting to be a rock star. That didn't fully work out, but I make more music now than I've ever made my entire life, and I can thank podcasting for that because it affords me the ability to like have this great home studio and get all this nerdy synth stuff, and also we podcast remotely now, and so I'm able to kind of like do the podcasting and then also after that make music for podcasts, for other shows, little music cues. I've kind of done everything from the editing side to the hosting side to the EPing side. But the storytelling angle, I mean, for me, I just think like Ben, being an only child, I kind of had to find my people in fiction or in film and cinema, in songwriting, which is storytelling in and of itself. And I think at the end of the day, I just like talking to people and sharing and learning and listening. And the shows that Ben and I do together, Stuff That I Want You to Know and Ridiculous History, are conversational shows where we sort of learn things together in real time with the audience.
Did you feel like you were an outsider as a kid? Did that drive some of this creativity?
Definitely. I mean, at least I don't know about but definitely on my end, I am a military brat, which means I moved around quite a bit. I was left to my own devices in a very beautiful, creative way. And I always sort of, I think a lot of times creative people live with some percentage of their mind in the day-to-day real world, and then some other percentage in the world that could be, or the what ifery, So some of my best friends growing up, as weird as it might sound, were probably fictional characters.
What about you, Noel? Growing up, outsider? I imagine a kid wandering around an opera house while his parents are going on and off stage, literally, and the magic of that world being very real. Is that real?
It was fascinating because like I took it for granted at the time, obviously, because it was just what I was presented with. But now looking back, I walked around New York in the 90s when I was 12 by myself. And I look back on that, I'm like, what are you thinking, Mom? How irresponsible. But also it was amazing. I really was able to kind of be left to my own devices and explore and really learn a lot about. Yeah, exactly. And I was kind of an outsider because I was the only kid, in the opera house, aside from maybe a couple of other kids that were along for the ride like me, or maybe kids that were in the show. But yeah, I absolutely felt the same way. And then I found my people later in life in high school with like band, people I was in bands with, and, D&D nerds and people I'd sit with at lunch that were into weird counterculture stuff like me. So those are the people that are our people now. That listen to the show and that reach out and that we actually connect with. That's a big part of what we do, is connecting with the audience and having that dialogue. And that's possible with podcasts more than I think any other entertainment medium, that direct connection with an audience.
I don't want to leapfrog over a big milestone in your guys' sort of creative careers, but there was a show that you launched and worked on together called Stuff They Don't Want You to Know. Massive show, many, many millions of downloads a month. After that show, and that show was more than anything about conspiracy theories, the roles they play in our lives, how sometimes they're more real than we maybe would like to believe or certainly know. Out of that show, you guys launched a new show called Ridiculous History. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting when it was launched in podcasting, because there was this surge of history content in podcasting early. Lore with our friend Aaron Mahnke, stuff you missed in history class with our colleagues, Holly and Tracy. Ridiculous History almost felt like in reaction to that. I don't want to put words in your guys' mouths, but it was almost like, let's not take this too seriously. History is also absurd and cyclical and crazy and tangential. Oh, yeah. But where for you, starting with you, Ben, like where did the idea come from? Like why this show? Why this title? What was the vibe?
Yeah, so this show is really special to us because originally it was something that would be windowed on a single platform, right? But we also, you run into new experimental shows all the time. And in that regard, it was experimental, but also there's something so powerful about approachability, right? Sometimes when people think of history, we think of dusty old textbooks, sometimes textbooks with an agenda or something, but really history is a palimpsest. It is a conversation, and what we wanted to do was emphasize how history is human. Like the people thousands of years ago were just as intelligent as the people of 2022, and perhaps even arguably better attuned to their environment. So we wanted to find those moments of triumph and those moments of relatable foibles that we could share. And I think we're both, if either of us have an addiction, I think our addiction is learning. And that's one thing that's beautiful about Ridiculous History. Like we just recently, I'll give you one example. We just recently did an excellent two-part episode on how British suffragettes in the move to get the right to vote learned jujitsu and created this is a true story, Conal, create a crack squad of like high-level jujitsu bodyguards to protect people who were pivotal in that movement. And they regularly waxed the police and like the dudes who were mad about everybody getting to vote. I don't know. That stood out to me, Noel. I mean, that's the secret sauce for us. We love that stuff.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, the name says it all. I mean, it is about ridiculous moments in history, but it's also two guys that don't take ourselves too seriously. This sounds lame, but we're just like you. We just want to learn. We want to find this stuff out. Oftentimes we'll make mistakes and we lean into it and own it. We are not trying to, be the end all be all. We are interested in this stuff and fascinated by it and do our homework, but history is weird, and sometimes there are conflicting reports about things, and when we find those, we own up to it, obviously. But like the fact that we're not trying to act like we are the experts, I think, is what makes the show relatable, and we kind of are stumbling through this stuff just like everybody else who's listening. So I think that's important. Relatability.
Let me ask a different kind of origin story. So there's one thing to ask about, where'd you get this sort of spark of wanting to create and communicate? The other is, where did you guys get this filter on life that is conspiracy theory obsessives, and now the absurdity of history enthusiasts, like using different words and muddling through this, obviously, but you have this lens on life that is very dark, different, curious, the margins. Where did that come from? From Stuff They Don't Want You to Know, the show that you had done previously, to Ridiculous History, I see a through line of like, it's all made up. It's all crazy. Don't you guys see it? Ben, what about you? Like, where do you think that came from?
That's a really interesting question. And it's something that I have not thought about too much. So yeah, I agree with you that there does seem to be a thematic or narrative through line. Perhaps the best way to inform that is to say that Stuff They Don't Want You to Know is critical thinking applied to all that crazy stuff on the fringes. And what surprised us, along with our day one colleague, Mr. Matt Frederick, I think what surprised the three of us there was that often, on a troubling frequency, we would find a grain of truth in some of the most bizarre stories. And then at some point, we started realizing, hey, this is happening so often that maybe the truth about history is that it's full of absurd and ridiculous things. And then we kept digging. There's a lot of overlap in the audience. There's a lot of overlap in some of the stories, especially about, government cover-ups or weird things like the CIA trying to make cat spies, like house cats into spies. That was a real thing. And so we wanted to share that because we're kind of demystifying. I would say we're demystifying history.
Well, in the same way that we find, these grains of truth in conspiracy theories, and again, the term conspiracy theory has sort of become this term of abuse that is intended to shut down a conversation. So we try very carefully not to cast ourselves. We are not conspiracy theorists. We discuss these things as they pertain to the zeitgeist and the conversation around politics, around history. It really is. You're absolutely right, Conal. There is a through line between the two. And we also find with Ridiculous History, as we know, history is often written and guided by the victors, the ones that won the conflict, or, the patriarchy, for example. They're the ones who are writing these stories. So you have to take sort of a critical eye even to just history and not take everything at face value. So there is that through line between both shows that I think is very important.
Noel, let me hang on you for a sec, because you guys said something a couple of minutes ago that I think is really interesting, but also kind of scary. The role of the individual in history. History is ridiculous in large part, I think, and why this show, Ridiculous History, is so smart is because it highlights this. It's driven almost entirely by human decision making, and humans making those decisions. And humans are inherently eccentric and wacky and unpredictable. I mean, we see this today and in our own elections and what's happening right now in warfare around the world, that at some point flows back to an individual who made a call. When you see this again and again in your ridiculous history topics and your episodes, don't want to put words in your mouth. I imagine that's as much an awesome idea that humans have so much agency in their own lives, but also in the landscape of history, as it is a scary idea that humans have so much agency in history. But Noel, you've done hundreds of these episodes now. Is that a takeaway you have pretty consistently? And is it scary?
Well, it's like, what choice do we have? You can either be terrified of the awful power of the human species and live every day in existential dread, or you can try to wrap your head around it and realize we all have a finite time on this planet, and it's better just to be curious and dig in and answer some of these questions, knowing you'll never be able to answer all of them, but why not at least just enjoy life before we blow ourselves up? Sorry. But yeah, I mean, it's true, it is scary, but it also, like, what is the alternative? Like, written language is in and of itself inherently flawed and malleable and can be misinterpreted. And just the fact that all of these other languages exist, and just by writing something like, say, the King James Bible, that is a political translation based around the views of one monarch that then became the version of the Bible. So it's like, that is all throughout history. Ben, I know that you feel very similar about this, and we talk about it all the time, at the bar and on mic.
Right. Yeah, no, you're spot on, Noel. And I think one reason I think that is such an excellent paradox to point to is exactly what you've described, Conal, to look at the amazing acts of nobility. Like the idea that one guy, for instance, Louis Pasteur, was able to save so many people through pasteurization. The idea that someone like Norman Borlaug through the Green Revolution would be able to save billions of people's lives. The guy who invented the seatbelt may have saved the most lives ever in the entirety of human history, other than the people who said, let's not launch nuclear weapons. And this sort of stuff, for every amazing story like that, through a show that I used to do called Stuff of Genius, which was an animated thing about inventors. And for every one of those, there's also a dark analog of some sort where one person can do tremendously terrible things. And those people, again, the startling thing is, those people, for anyone watching this, they're very much like you. They want the same things. They are rational actors. History is human. And that's what I think people forget sometimes. And also the best way to learn about anything, I think, is to make it relatable, to make it feel experiential, and to have a little bit of a sense of humor about it. Because like Noel said, in any time of adversity or any time of danger, really humor and history are human, is what I would say. And they're linked together. And if you can't look back on some of the crazy things that people did and not understand why it's funny, then I don't know if you're looking at it the right way. That's what we try to do. We're hoping that our show can inspire, the future versions of us, the kids who are sitting there maybe felt like they didn't fit in, or maybe thought that history was being too top down in the way it was communicated with them. So that's who we're making the show for, I think.
I think you've hit those notes in this show with just pitch perfection. I think you have a show in Ridiculous History that was so strong growing so fast. We've literally now franchised this out into new shows. The new hit show from the iHeartPodcast network is called Ridiculous Crime. Very similar approach. And we'll have those guys on in a coming week to talk about what they're doing there, because it's a great show, but it's similar in its attitude. It's taking a well-worn genre in podcasting that's growing and just coming at it a little bit more lightheartedly and maybe a little bit more humanly in a weird way. But I love this notion that Ridiculous History has nailed, which is that history may be ridiculous because humans are ridiculous, but whether history is good or bad depends on what, in large part, a human's motivation is to do a thing. And so it gives listeners a lot of agency like that. Listen, we are in the middle of this medium that has 120 million Americans a month now listening. It's exploding. It shows engagement like no other medium today. And I just want to thank you guys, because you were there right around the beginning, and the shows that you've hosted, executive produced, put out there in the world are a huge part of why this medium is as big as it is today. So thanks for hanging out with me, but thanks for that bigger thing too.
Yeah, always a pleasure.
Well, thank you, Conal, because I don't know if you've said this or if our audience knows this, but every step of the way, at least in my experience, I was very fortunate to be hanging with you, and you didn't say yes to everything. And for the record, when you said no, I'll say it, you were usually right. But we also, I think it's important to say that we on the creative side, we have autonomy that is undreamt of in other media. And for that, I think Noel and I are both really grateful. So thank you as well.
No doubt.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.